Hello everyone, Simon Jacobson here, and for the second week in a row, God has other plans. I find it quite unnerving and surreal actually. Almost 30 years that I've been giving this class, I've always insisted and made sure to be on location. And I've shared many times the reason why, because I've always believed what I learned from my Rabbi and from all the great people I've known. You start something good, you have to be consistent, no matter rain or shine, cold or hot. No matter what, you continue. And it has its impact. And here, 2 weeks in a row, as much as I tried, I could not make it on location. Last week was Hurricane Sandy that caused this horrific traffic, impossible to get into the city. There was no public transportation. We're still reeling from that here in New York. And now this week we have a blizzard going on, which again has made it very difficult to travel. And even though I was almost planning to go and be on location, but I realized if no one's going to be there, what's the point? So, though I'm broadcasting from the warmth of my environment, my home, online, the miracles of technology, I just feel I should be sharing that because I feel there was a certain beauty in actually making the trip, going on location. As I said, it may not make a difference to most of you because you're just listening online in the comforts of your homes and wherever you may be in the world. The sun, you may be basking in the sun, you may be inside of your bubble bath, or wherever it is that you find your comfort. But I find it quite strange and interesting, and yet we're here. And the topic of this class is Buddhism and Judaism. I should say Judaism and Buddhism, being that Judaism precedes Buddhism. Now, of course, immediately putting these two together in one title is for some sacrilegious, considered to be, how could you equate the two, how could you put them in the same sentence? Isn't it heretical? Judaism is Judaism, it's absolute truths coming from Sinai, from God, and how do you dare bring Buddhism into the picture? But at the same time, we live in a world where they say over 30% of American Buddhists are Jewish. And Buddhism has for some reason captivated the attention, captivated the minds and hearts of many, many Jews. I personally have met many whose spiritual journey began through Buddhism and not through Judaism, sadly. Others actually discovered Buddhism and then through that rediscovered their Judaism and its mystical dimension. And the reason is very obvious. Because the Judaism they were exposed to had nothing to do with spirituality. It was either mechanical, didactic, dogmatic, or it was superficial, diluted, almost like a joke. Ask most people what their experience was of a Seder table, Passover Seder. Ask yourself, ask your friends, or even experience of Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah. At best you'll find warm, nostalgic, getting together with a family. Rarely will you hear deeply meaningful, transformative, insightful, spiritual. So when someone's hungry and someone's a seeker, a traveler, where do they turn? If they don't find it in their own backyard, in their own bar mitzvah lessons and bat mitzvah lessons. Ask people about those two, about those lessons, and you get the story. The classic story of the guy, the rabbi, the joke, the rabbi, an old synagogue is looking for a rabbi. They finally find a candidate, they're showing him around, and they're talking, and they like him, and they're about to hire him, but they give him a royal tour in this old building of theirs. As they're traveling through, as they're walking through the building, one of the board members says to him, Rabbi, we have a really aging synagogue, and we don't really expect much. We expect you to maintain the membership as much as you can. People are dying after all, but as far as the next generation, we've given up. Okay, the rabbi listens quietly. As they're continuing their walk, they're walking down to the lower bottom line, the basement of the synagogue. And as they walk down, another board member says to the rabbi, listen, we don't want to scare you. It's not life-threatening, but this is an old building. It's infested. And down there was some rodents. I don't want to mention which type, but you can use your own imagination. I don't want to cause anyone to shriek either. They're rodents. Okay. And we've tried everything we've tried. We can't really exterminate them, so we keep them at bay. But it's just a nuisance. The rabbi looks at them and says, I think I have a solution. Even before you hire me, I already have a solution for this. He says, what are you going to say? He says, let me tell you what we should do. We should have the women's alumni of the synagogue knit little taluses, prayer shawls for each of the rats, and then knit for them small yarmulkes, kippot, put it on their heads. We'll bar mitzvah them, and we'll never see them again. Obviously, he was reacting to what they said, that the young people don't come. Which is true. The end of many people's Judaism is the bar mitzvah, the bat mitzvah. So it's obvious that someone is a seeker, someone has some type of soul, looking for something, searching for transcendence. You go wherever you can find it. Not in your backyard, you go to other yards. And sometimes even to unhealthy places. A hungry person, a thirsty person, is both a beautiful, powerful force, but it can also be a very dangerous force. Wherever there's a void, a vacuum, you can assume that something's going to captivate that vacuum. And that's what happened. In the 60s particularly, with many, many young Jews beginning to seek, with Far Eastern disciplines being brought to the shores here, whether it was the Beatles into a relationship for a short period of time with the Maharashi, or it was the transcendental meditation. Buddhism, and particularly Zen Buddhism and the different schools of Buddhism, spoke to many, many Jews. Many Jews became Buddhists, if one could become a Buddhist. You have Ramdas, Steve Alpert, and you have many others who became, that's what they embraced. They saw in it a spirituality that spoke to them. Others went even further and came to discover, as I mentioned, from that, their Jewish spirituality. So the first tragedy is that spirituality is not taught in our schools, not taught to our Jewish youth. Just look at every stereotype, any Woody Allen film. The Judaism is presented in the most hollow, irrational, superstitious fashion. Very often it's associated with anger and guilt and vindication and punitive reactions, with everything that is negative. Why would anyone want to have a relationship with such a religion? Take into account also the battle between science and religion, which basically between faith and reason, and religion has really become beat up, battered, and for many times, and very often for the right reasons, because it did not speak to people. It became bureaucratic, controlled by corrupt leadership, and I mean across the board, especially in the Christian world and other schools of thought. So Jews, growing up intelligent, seeking, clearly went to seek and find something that may work for them. And therefore, it's no surprise that you find so many Jews that have embraced Buddhist type of ideas and thinking. I recall meeting my good friend Leonard Cohen. Some of you may know Leonard Cohen, the singer-songwriter, a Montreal boy. His father raised money for the UJA, proudly Jewish, ends up in a Zen monastery in California. It's a long story how I got to know him. It was through an article I wrote. Actually, it was called the Silent Kohen. Kohen is a term, Koan, a term in Zen Buddhism, used a certain type of exercise. I don't think they like to use the word exercise, a type of journey to get to places that are beyond logic, beyond our logic, to be able to experience the spirit, the oneness of spirit, go into a world of paradox. The most famous koan is, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Forcing you to go into a world of silence, into a world that is not governed by conventional material logic. So I wrote the Silent Kohen with a double entendre in mind. Kohen also, Kohen, the priest, Silent Kohen, speaking about silence and sound. If any of you want to see this article and the series connected to it, just go to meaningfullife.com and type in Silent Kohen and you'll find it. So it was a double thing. Leonard Cohen happens to be a Kohen. His name, Cohen. So he writes me a long gloss and commentary on my article and signs it Eliezer Kohen, the priest Eliezer. And being somewhat having more than dabbled, being involved in Zen Buddhism, knowing familiar with it, he addresses the whole topic with me. And we had this fascinating exchange back and forth, comparing Buddhist thought and Jewish thought. So here's a man, a man who's impacted millions of people, a brilliant person, gone through a lot of pain and suffering, and he found something in Buddhism. Just for the record, when I asked him outright, he says, I'm a Jew, I'm not a Buddhist. The reason I'm here is because the Roshi, which is the Roshi, interesting, similar to the Hebrew word Rosh, like head, like a type of Rebbe, a type of guru, the Roshi, he impacted me deeply. And that's why I came here. I actually visited him in the monastery. We spent the whole evening, bringing, as they say, speaking. But he's one example of many. As I said, he qualified and said very clearly, I'm not a Buddhist, I'm a Jew, and he's familiar with the ideas and teachings. So you have the story of Buddhism, if you want to call it affecting or infecting many, many Jews. And I don't say that necessarily in a derogatory fashion. Clearly something about it is resonating. So just to dismiss it and say, hey, we can't speak about Buddhism and Judaism, hey, my friends, this is a fact on the ground. You can't put your, like an ostrich, stick your head in the ground and make believe like it doesn't exist. It exists. And it's intriguing. Why? Why are 30% of Jews Buddhists? I understand Jews are seekers, but what do they see in Buddhism? Why don't they go? Why aren't 30% of Catholics Jews? God forbid, obviously. Or other religions. Something about the Far Eastern teachings that speak to the Jewish soul. And then when you actually dabble or you read a bit about some of the Far Eastern disciplines, and they're very diverse, and I can make it very clear, I'm by no means an expert. From the little I've read, there are many, many schools of thought. You have Confucianism, you have Taoism, you have Zen Buddhism, you have many different types. You have, of course, Hinduism, which came later. Many different variations, many different dialects, many different approaches. Some reject the other approaches as much as Protestants rejected Catholicism. Some see others as heretical. There's discussion whether they believe in a deity or not. What is the Buddha's role, etc., etc. Now, I'm not here to give a course on Buddhism. That's not my expertise. It's not my forte. I'm here to talk about something that I believe is relevant to all of us, this phenomenon, and what we can learn from it. But above all, why did I choose to discuss it this week? Because this may fascinate some of you, may intrigue some of you, because in the Bible, in the Parsha that we're reading this week, Chayei Sarah, which is the 5th chapter of the book of Genesis, chapter 25, verse 6, it speaks specifically about Abraham, the first journey to the east. Those are the actual words from the Bible. So what does it say? Let me give it to you in context. After Sarah had passed away, his beloved Sarah, and after Abraham had buried her, together with his son Isaac. Isaac was the child of Abraham and Sarah, as we read earlier. And Isaac began to build his life. And the story tells about how Abraham sent his Eliezer, his servant, to go find a wife for Isaac. And they marry. So it says, when it concludes, after Isaac marries Rivka, so then it continues and says, that Abraham went back and took a wife to him. Keturah is her name. But as Rashi says, the commentary says, her name, that was Hagar. Hagar was his initial concubine, his initial wife that Sarah had given him when he was unable to have a child with her, through which Yishmael was born. Yishmael would be the ancestor and forefather of the Ishmaelites, the Arabs, that would later also become, many of them, Muslims. So he took her back, this Keturah. As Rashi says, Zu Hagar v'nikra Keturah al shem shenoyim maser k'kteris. Why then she called Keturah? Because Keturah comes from the word incense. The incense in the temple. Incense is like a spice. Spices that had they gave off a very beautiful and pleasant aroma. And so it says, it's called Keturah because her actions were as beautiful as incense. And she also remained loyal to Abraham. She never went off with any other man. In other words, that purity, comparing her to incense, is what brought Abraham back to her. That's why the Torah emphasizes that her name is Keturah, which is interesting, because many people think Hagar is dismissed as something like, second class. It's not correct. Hagar is Abraham's wife. They had a child together. Abraham anguished when he had to send away Hagar and Ishmael. There was a reason for that at the time. And now he brings the Keturah back. And it says that they have children, they have more children, and their names, Zimron, Yokshan, Midon, Yeshabak, Suach, the Midianites would come from here. And it talks about some of their lineage. And then the Torah continues, Vayitna Avram es kol shaloi liYitzchak. Abraham gave all his possessions, because we're already talking about the end of Abraham's life. It's winding down here at the end of this chapter. So it says that Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. And then he continues, and to the children that he had with the Torah, Abraham gave them gifts and sent them away from his son Isaac, while he was alive, Kadema, to the east. El Eretz Kedem. El Eretz Kedem. He sent them to the east, to the eastern land. What gifts did he give them? So there are different opinions. But one, the primary one, which Rashi brings immediately, he gave them holy names that had the ability also to be defiled. But he gave them names, referring to spiritual wisdom, basically. So here you have it. Approximately 3,800 years ago this takes place. Abraham sends the children of Hagar and his children and Hagar to the east, a journey to the east, like Hermann Hesse's journey to the east, with names, with spiritual wisdom. We don't know a lot about the details what that wisdom entailed, but then when you begin to read and see the ideas and teachings in Buddhism and in Far Eastern disciplines of all the different sorts that have such powerful similarities to Jewish mysticism, to spirituality that we are familiar with in the Jewish teachings, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to equate two and two together. Where did this wisdom come from? Abraham, the source of father of all nations, including the other religions that came from the children of Esau, which is a grandson of Abraham, and the children of Yishmael, a son of Abraham, that the teachings of Abraham, who was then the predominant and pioneer of ideas about God, ideas about spirit, that he passed it on to his children, obviously, and gave it to them as gifts to travel with them to the east. So I think to myself, God's mysterious ways. Perhaps Abraham planted and embedded seeds. Well, not perhaps, he definitely did. Seeds of divine wisdom all over the world. And for his children that are connected to Isaac, at that point, he sent them away from Isaac. But at some point, when Isaac's grandchildren would one day perhaps wander and get lost and not be able to find the spirituality in their own backyard, they're able to find sparks of it in the Far East, in the eastern lands. Why else would we be told the story? So let me share the following episode that, in a way, can capture this. I've told this story more than once because it's very both quite humorous but very powerful. In the around 10 years ago, I had a radio show, a weekly radio show called Torah Meaning for Life. Surprise, surprise. Torah Meaning for Life. It was called a show for skeptics and seekers. It was a live radio show every Sunday evening from 6 to 7, live with call-ins. And I chose particularly issues and topics that were off-center, meaning things that people did not address, topics that I thought were very relevant, but most people shied away from. And the calls that would come in were just fascinating. It was just unbelievable. So one week I did the class, I think it was one of the last, not class, I did a show, one of the last shows. It was called Growing Through Your Past. Now we all have lives. We all have pasts. Some of us have very colorful pasts. Some of us have a past that we'd prefer to forget. Mistakes we made, childish, juvenile blunders. Everyone's got their stuff that they experiment with that they're not so proud of. We all have our tattoos, our wounds, our war wounds, our battle wounds. And the question really, from a Jewish perspective, from a Torah perspective, what do you do with such a past? So of course we all know the concept of tshuva. Tshuva means not just that you regret the past and you move on, it also means transforming the past. Tshuva from the word return. You transform your past. You redeem it by channeling the wisdom and the experiences. And even the hunger that brought you to that negative place, you now channel it to a positive place. So thus you you can transform a crime. You can transform a darkness into light. If you now have learned from your experience and only uniquely new to you, because only you went through that experience, you use it now in positive ways, it becomes a transformation. There's even the Talmud is always very blunt. There's a blunt expression for it. The pillows that she offered in sin, she now offered in mitzvah, beheter, permissible. Talking about a prostitute who offered pillows to a certain sage. So now, later, at the end of the story, she does tshuva and she comes back to live a healthy, spiritual Jewish life. So it says the pillows that she offered once in sin, now she offered in heter, permissibly. Which is meaning to emphasize that same pillows become transformed. It's a metaphor for transformation. So we don't just forget. We don't cut off. We don't amputate our pasts, which is a critical psychological lesson in life. Obviously, we all would prefer to live a life that's called Adam Yashar Helech. You go straight, you don't make mistakes, you preempt problems. But all of us will blunder. All of us will have our flaws. We will fall at times. What do you do with that? So you can have a school of thought that teaches, ignore it, move on. Actually, write off the past. There are many people, they call them Balei Tshuva, who write off the past. They almost like forget about that person. But that's your personality. That's part of who you are. It would be like destroying the healthy cells with the bad cells. So there's a critical component of realizing two things. Number one is you do not want to annihilate your past. You want to redeem it. You may want to throw away the shell and keep the fruit, but you don't want to throw away the fruit with it. And number two, you want it to be integrated with your life. It's not just about, I didn't keep Shabbat, now I keep Shabbat. I didn't eat kosher, now I eat kosher. I didn't put on tefillin, now I do. That's tshuva in action. What about your personality? The personality that was there before, that did not keep Shabbat and now does, is still the same personality. That's real tshuva, where there's a transformation of person, of spirit, of psyche, psychological transformation. This is a small introduction to the story I want to tell. So I was talking about this radio show, Growing Through Our Pasts. And I brought an example. An example was of a fellow that came to my class, and it was at the end of the class, one of the Wednesday night classes, like tonight, and he clearly was high on something. It may become apparent from the story what it was. And he loudly says, I want to ask a question, Rabbi Jacobson. Okay, ask. I grew up in a relatively traditional home. I was bar mitzvah, I put on tefillin, kept kosher, Shabbat. But then when I was around 16, 17 years old, I dropped it all. It was just cultural for me. It was a program. It was brainwash. I didn't see it speak to me. And I dropped it all. I went off on my own journey. This is him talking. I can't even really emulate it. I'm sharing this on the radio show, mind you. And I discovered spirituality, but not in Jewish pastures. I discovered it in a thing called LSD, which, as some of you may know, is not an acronym for Let's Start Davening. Right? LSD is called acid, a chemical drug used by many for enlightenment purposes. I won't go into a whole analysis of the LSD generation, Timothy Leary, Aldous Huxley, the debates. Till 1966, it was actually still legal. It was used in experiments in the 50s in Berkeley and other universities. It's a topic I've discussed other times. Though I'm very familiar with it, but as a strong disclaimer, I've never was tempted by it, that, for that matter, any type of foreign substance. Even though some people think I have, based on my way of speaking and an intimacy and knowledge with these ideas. I guess that's a compliment or maybe not. Anyway, so he says, and that's what I discovered. And then he added, and Zen Buddhism. Zen Buddhism and LSD. He says, one day I'm flying back from the West Coast to the East Coast. And whenever I go on a plane, I always take some acid. Drop some acid is the right expression. And I'm just looking out there, the clouds are vibrating, the sky is like a rainbow, everything is pulsating with energy. And the back of the airplane, I hear a minyan, a quorum, people davening, they're praying. And I hear them say, Kaddish, 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 holy, holy, holy. Hashem, they're talking about the angels that say, holy, holy, holy about God. So suddenly when I heard that, I literally was able to visualize and sense the celestial bodies, those angels singing. I felt it. I felt the divine throne, and I felt the holiness. It all came back to me in a very powerful, personal way. And I ran back to the back of the plane, and I said, let me put on tefillin. And I put on tefillin for the first time in many years. LSD is what brought me back to Judaism. Today I'm kosher, I keep Shabbat, I put on tefillin. What do you have to say about that? And the whole class was very quiet. They all wanted to see, what am I going to say? Am I going to endorse it? Am I going to endorse it? Well, obviously I wasn't going to endorse it. So after the prerequisite joke where I said, okay, look, you may have to go to some like OU or OK or some of these rabbinic organizations that give hashgacha. They give an endorsement, whether it's kosher or not, for LSD, because I'm not in that business. But to respond to your question, on a serious note, I will respond with an analogy. Imagine somebody, God forbid, gets into an accident, and they fall into a comatose state. And nothing the doctors do can revive that person. Until one doctor suggests, you know what? We can't let this person atrophy. We can't let him just remain as a vegetable in a coma forever. Let us inject him with a very serious, intense amount of drugs that'll perhaps shake up his system and get him out of the coma. You would never give these drugs to any healthy person. It can kill them. And they try it, and you know what? He's revived. What would you say? I see the same, I equate the two. What would you say? You'd say, for a person who's in a comatose state and there's nothing else helping, you try anything. But no way do you endorse and say, oh, this is a method, this is an approach. This is not an approach. Now I say to you, now that you've discovered the spirituality, however you did, this is called tshuva. Now learn you can discard these foreign substances. Now you know and find in Judaism those deeper spiritual truths that you can study in the books, in mysticism, experience them through mitzvahs, which is a whole elaborate system, a 613-step program that teaches us how to access our soul, how to access the cosmos, how to rise to a more spiritual place in our lives. So in God's mysterious ways, it could be that a soul that went into a coma, yours and many others, that did not find it spiritual nourishment and nurturing in their own environments, in their Judaism, in their bar mitzvahs and so on, God may be planted in certain chemicals, in mushrooms, in the Far East. No way would I tell somebody who I meet, you have to go there. I'd say, come study it in Judaism. But in our bizarre world, there are bizarre solutions. So it's not initially a solution, it's a solution after the fact. And that's a critical component. In Torah, there's a statement, Echte v'ashuv, I will sin and I will return. That tshuva is not acceptable. Someone will say, you know what, I'll sin. I'll learn the experiences that you can learn only in darkness. And I'll then elevate it and transform it to a far greater place that a tzaddik can never reach. No. The prosecutor cannot become the defense. Something that is negative cannot become positive, because then you're using the negative. But if by accident, or because of lack of knowledge, or whatever reason, even if it was deliberate, but it was not, in a sense, directly for that intention, and you happen to fall in a dark place, you can grow from that. God forbid, no person should ever experience abuse, pain, any type of hurt. But those that do, after the fact, you're not damaged goods. You're not a broken machine. You now can dig deeper and find a refinement and purity that you never could have found otherwise. But to go there initially, who would make such a statement? I should become sick in order to be healthier? I should get a cold in order to build up immunity to that strain of bacteria? Once it happens, you redeem it. You throw away, as I said, you throw away the shell, the husk, and you retain the fruit, what you've learned and how you grow through it. I say this as an elaborate example because what happened next was fascinating. The calls started coming in on the radio, and I was surprised. I thought someone would criticize, how could I say such a thing? I'm advocating, God forbid, I wasn't advocating LSD. I was saying a redeeming factor, like a redeeming factor in far worse sins. Tshuva is on everything. But I got calls the other way around. Why do you knock it? Why do you say a person can't maintain it? Have you ever tried it? Why are you knocking these drugs? I think they should be legalized. And this became a whole debate, one call after the next. Thank God my good friend Philip Namelworth was in the studio, radio studio at the time, because I had to be honest. And I said, no, I never tried it. So they said, you seem like an open man. How could you criticize something you've never tried? Now, obviously, we don't have to try everything to criticize things. And I wasn't criticizing, I was actually just discussing the angles of it. Because there's a whole other discussion, what are the negative parts of drugs and of foreign substances? Besides the illegal element, psychologically, spiritually, it's called foreign fire. It's not so simple. But I didn't have that credibility, and I wanted someone with credibility. So I said, Philip, get come to the microphone. And he got on and enumerated a list of his medicine chest, his pharmaceuticals, they used to call the pharmacists, of the different types of mushrooms, etc., etc. And he then discussed how he discovered exactly that. He once found spirituality that way, and then found it through Judaism. So I'm saying all of this to qualify that when we talk about Buddhism, I'm talking for a Jew. It is really, if someone after the fact, those sparks were there, I have no problem saying that that's exactly why our grandfather Abraham. But he says, Vishalchem al Yitzchak b'noi. Why does it have to tell us that he sent them away, these children, to the east, with these secrets, with his wisdom, away from Yitzchak b'noi? Because Yitzchak b'noi, he gave another path. He gave them the path of Torah and mitzvahs. He gave them the path of spirituality, the way the Jews have always taught it. But at the same time, this doesn't mean that other parts of the world or other people find the spirituality in different ways. And should one day one of the children of Abraham, of Isaac, wander and get lost, he finds a spark. It reminds him. It's a reminder. And in it lays embedded the wisdom that Abraham implanted years and years ago, thousands of years ago. Yes, they may have accumulated other ideas, maybe some things that would be foreign to Abraham's teachings. But the same is true with Christianity and Islam. Maimonides writes that they both paved the way to the Messiah, because they both introduced unity into the world and the belief in the Messiah. Well, you say, is that advocating it? Is he condoning it? No. He's saying, number one is that for a non-Jew, those are definitely methods that are viable. Number two, even from a Jewish perspective, you have to say that the fact that God allowed these religions to propagate, to perpetuate, to grow, to multiply, is because it helps in some way pave. Even though we may have certain disagreements, or there may be some things that, from a Jewish perspective, we would see as being inappropriate or distorted and so on. And I'm not here to make comparisons right now between religions. That's not the point, or to pull rank. So the bottom line is that sparks, absolutely. There are sparks everywhere, we're told. There's sparks in everything in the universe. But many sparks remain sealed and locked in a certain item. That's called osir. When something is prohibited, as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, that same Tanya that talks about Shuvah, transformation, osir in Hebrew means bound. Like hostage. Like tied up. Those sparks are bound in places that we're not supposed to enter. As I said before, Echtev osir, God forbid, you're not supposed to go there. You preempt it. You learn to be wise. You don't have to make every mistake to become wiser. Someone will say, because of experience, I want to try out everything. I'll make every mistake I can, and then I'll learn from that. That's ridiculous, obviously. Trust me, we'll have our own mistakes. You don't have to go and be deliberate about. We have enough of our that we're not deliberate about. But should one person fall in there, in a place that's osir, the kosher, b'yad chitzenim, it's bound and it's trapped and bound in the hands of the externals, you can redeem even that. And that I speak from a Jewish perspective. So there's no doubt in my mind, especially when you read and you hear about Buddhist ideas, you clearly see similarities. And I want to talk about some of those similarities, as well as some fundamental differences. This is part of my correspondence that I had with Leonard Cohen. Let me just say the following, and this is a critical context. There's a significant difference between Western thought and Eastern thought. I'm not even talking Judaism right now. Western thought, Western philosophies, Greek philosophies, as opposed to the Eastern philosophies. And one of the ways they're distinguishable is one is very built somewhat more what we would call structural logic philosophy, and the other one is far more like yin and yang, far more ethereal and beyond logic. One is intuitive, the Far Eastern, the other one is raw and brutal logic. Sometimes they're compared East and West. This thinking that the West is similar more to Newtonian physics, and the East more to quantum mechanics. So Newtonian physics, like mathematics, is very structured. It's called the billiard ball effect. Cause and effect. You strike a billiard ball this way, and it will always have that next. The cause and effect will always be precise, predictable. But a world of unpredictability, of indeterminism, of uncertainty, a state of probability, is not something that Western thought initially related to. It actually went counter to everything that was in Western thought. That's why it was rejected. Einstein could not deal with it. Einstein famously said, God doesn't play dice. To which Niels Bohr, another Jew, by the way, responded, don't tell God what to do. So which one is it? Did God create a finite, a rigid, and inflexible, and predictable structure, which we see? The sun rises, you can predict sunrises, you can predict the moon. You can not just predict, the patterns, they're all etched in stone. You know exactly when the dawn breaks. The rooster will cry out. The whole balance of nature, how nature works, it seems as organized and synchronistic as it gets. Completely inflexible. I mean, flexible within its structure, but I mean to say inflexible, it's completely predictable, a structure of law and order. Is that what God did and doesn't play dice? Or is there an indeterministic, somewhat of an amorphous, nebulous state of affairs? And the answer today in physics, we know, they're both true. In the microscopic world, things are in states of probability. And in the macroscopic world, things are very defined, and is this and not that. So you can distinguish somewhat between West and East in this type of fashion. Some people associate it with masculine and feminine. Some people associate it with zeros and ones, where circular is far more Eastern. And the goal there is to get beyond the constraints of logic, to get beyond the comfort zone of this material world and its structures. Where in the Western thought, it's about understanding what makes the material world tick. Now, with our wisdom today, we understand they're both correct. But there was a time these were two distinct entities. Now you can say these same two things you'll find in religion. For example, the Sufis, which are the mystical, the spiritual Muslims, were persecuted by the traditional Muslims, because they were far more into the spiritual, and the traditional were far more into the law and order. They saw that as a threat. And you could say even in Judaism, you find this. There's Judaism, the Western so-called type of thinking, halacha, law. Law is specific. There may be different opinions, there may be nuances, but it's about a mechanical understanding, the mechanics of Judaism. 39 works you're not allowed to do on Shabbat. And they break down even further. And you see the rigorous process of the Talmud in trying to analyze and trying to dissect any given halacha. Halacha is the rigid mechanics of Judaism. To the point of someone who's from the outside can see this almost as obsessive. Like lawyers, fine-picking the nuances, the details, every detail. Is this crumb permissible? Is it not permissible? The smallest details. Passover. The laws of Passover, just as an example. And then there's a thing called the spirituality of Judaism, the soul of Judaism, the mystical. Mystical, by definition, is not defined in a structure. Mystical doesn't occupy time and space. Not defined by time and space. Not confined by time and space. And you can say that this was also somewhat of a conflict. But the interesting thing in Judaism, it was never really a conflict. It was a conflict by some who misunderstood, who called themselves either halachists and others Kabbalists. But the greatest Kabbalists were halachic people, and the greatest halachic people were Kabbalists. Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, the greatest sage, the father of Jewish mysticism, the Zohar, was a great Talmudic giant from the students of Rabbi Akiva. And his colleagues did not see him as some type of anomaly or some type of marginal and so on. He was an anomaly, exceptionally anomaly, as an exceptional student, exceptional in his wisdom. Because the soul, as the Zohar itself says, because Judaism always had a soul and a body. The mechanics have a soul. And if you divorce the mechanics from the soul, you risk losing personal relevance. And yes, you risk becoming dogmatic and didactic, and risk alienating basically anyone that is looking for the soul. To the point that I remember people telling me, I discovered a soul in Buddhism. Judaism, there's a soul. I remember mentioning in the class that Judaism teaches us we have a soul. I remember one person was absolutely incredulous, an intelligent musician. He said, where's soul? What's soul? I never heard that Judaism believes in a soul. He was shocked. And when you say, Moda Ani in the morning, return my soul to me, and my soul is pure, and Ata Barasa Tahirihi, it's pure, and you created it, and you shaped it. He was shocked. I was shocked that he was shocked. So everybody was shocked. Okay, fine, we got beyond that. And then came the point where I said, this is ABC of Judaism. This isn't some 20th century innovation. This is ABC of Judaism. Abraham was a man of soul. He taught soul, spirit. He discovered a God that's not some type of juvenile fairy tale God of someone sitting with a long white beard on a throne waiting for us to misbehave and strikes us with lightning or with blizzards or hurricanes. It was a sophisticated system that he taught. At some point, due to lack of sophistication, due to assimilation, due to ignorance, due to whatever, our persecutions, it was lost on many. Which is why, going back to why many people went seeking spirituality elsewhere. Had they seen it in Judaism, why would they need to find it elsewhere? The same Abraham that sent those gifts to the east, taught it and put it into every part of his life. His good, his kindness, his chesed, his tzedakah, his chesed, his justice, tzedakah mishpat. Taught it to his son Isaac, Isaac to Jacob, Jacob to his children, Moses, Sinai. Sinai was a spiritual experience. Read the episode. Read the beginning of the Bible. God created the universe. It was all chaotic, dark. Let there be light. What light? The sun wasn't created till the fourth day. You're talking about spiritual concepts. Everything is spiritual in Judaism. But it's easy to ignore because we are people of flesh and blood. And of flesh and blood, we see things with flesh and blood eyes. We see the mechanical. It's harder to find the spirit. So these two are actually body and soul. What's a body without a soul? A corpse, God forbid. And a soul without a body is a non-concrete. It disappears. It dissipates. We need wick and flame. The flame is the flickering, restless soul. The wick is the grounding container that brings them together. In the words of the Kabbalists, er and keli, energy and container. The theme that's discussed in the centennial that I've been teaching every day, that you can see on YouTube, Ayin Beis. All about that tension and resolution of bringing container and energy together. Matter and spirit. Form and function. Body and soul. The inner and the outer. Immanence and transcendence. The list goes on. The defined and the tangible, and the undefined and the ethereal. The West and the East. So when we talk about going to the East, sending to the East, Eastern thought and Western thought, in many ways are antithetical. Which is why you see, as I said with physics, that the Western type of physics seemingly cannot relate to Eastern type of thought. It was the classic book by Fridtjof Capra called the Tao of Physics, where he draws all the parallels between Far Eastern thought and quantum mechanics. He was a physicist from Harvard. It's a fascinating book. It doesn't talk really about Judaism, but here's where it comes into play, the similarities and some of the differences between Buddhism and Judaism. As I said, this was part of the exchange. And it's fascinating things that we can learn from. Even if you're a Jew, sometimes you read something elsewhere, you can see from that and appreciate your own Judaism. So just as I said before, initially, learn it all in mysticism and Jewish mysticism. But if someone did find that spark, there's something they can learn from that, and they can teach. So just as Western thought negates so much and does not accept Eastern, Eastern negates and doesn't accept Western, and that's where Judaism comes in. Judaism is the total fusion of body and soul. In Buddhism, not all schools, but many, well, in all schools, but there's a question of primacy, question of dominance and how much, but in all of them, there's like the 4 cardinal rules in some of the schools of Buddhism that say, this world is suffering. All suffering comes from desire. Number 3, minimize desire, you minimize suffering. And then come methods of how you minimize desire, through a discipline in action and in behavior and so on and so forth. Interesting. How would Judaism react to that statement? Judaism would say, yes, there is suffering in this world, but would not say world equals suffering. Would not put it that way. There's suffering, but the world is not equal suffering. I'll get back to that in a minute. Therefore, what about desire? Well, desire, of course, we all know desire can be our undoing. Desire becomes an obsession. It's all about you and your arrogant desire. But desire itself has also value. What happens if you desire spirituality? What happens if you desire the truth? So the focus there is not me. My desire is always dangerous. It brings to suffering. Because if you didn't desire, you wouldn't suffer from lack of having something. That's the point. So the third step, which is eliminate desire, you eliminate suffering. Judaism says we're not suffering only. Desire isn't totally bad. Which really means the self. And we'll talk about that in a moment. The self is not really bad. And of course the fourth step, we all agree, disciplines, of course. Disciplines what creates channeling and harnessing and so on. So let's talk about this a little more. When you have a conflict between two worlds, there's really 3 solutions. Either one wins, or the other one wins. Or there's some type of compartmentalization. Fire and water are 2 opposites. But yet we've learned to harness them. Put fire and water head on with each other, enough fire will evaporate large body of water. Enough water will extinguish the largest fire. So how do we bring them together? You don't. What you do is, you put water in a kettle, you put the kettle on top of fire, so the kettle is being heated and the water can get boiled, and you can then use it for cooking, for tea, for coffee. So we've learned that they shouldn't completely integrate. There's a certain separation, and then you can bring them together. When you talk about matter and spirit, when you talk about the laws of logic, the structure of existence, and that which is beyond existence, how could the finite and the infinite meet? A fundamental theme in Buddhism and a fundamental theme in Jewish thought, in Jewish spirituality, mysticism. So either the finite wins or the infinite wins. If the infinite wins, then the finite structure of existence has to surrender is the right word. If the finite wins, the infinite surrenders. Can infinite and finite be bottled as one? That's the big question. Therefore, in Buddhist aspiration, a big goal is to get beyond the human conventions and structures, beyond our perception, beyond the things that limit us from really appreciating the light, essentially surrendering and weakening the hold and the hypnotic hold of the desire of this universe, which causes suffering, because when you feel you're lacking something, you're lacking money, you're envious, you're lacking this thing, you're lacking that thing. And then you can embrace the infinite. And what happens with a finite structure? You learn that it's either an illusion, or it's inferior, and something to be rejected. That is fundamental principles in Far Eastern thought, which are very appealing. For anyone living in a very material world, especially has seen corruption, has seen the Western world's decadence, very appealing. Many of the people searching Buddhism like the peacefulness of it, the calm. It's not a commercially driven. It's not about competition. It's not about all those human vices that are undoing, as much as we're addicted to them. It's a certain calm, realizing there's a higher reality. Don't take this reality so seriously. Don't take your money so seriously. Don't take your possessions so seriously. And when you come to realize that, you will reach a deeper calm, a deeper truth within yourself, within your soul, and so on. Very appealing. But the schools of thought in the Western world did not embrace that. They embraced, we are part of this world, and you have to figure out how to make it work. They embrace the finite, and often at the expense of the infinite. The structure at the expense of that which transcends the structure, the expense of transcendence. And what's the solution? So here too there are many schools of thought. I don't want to oversimplify it, but in broad strokes, it's basically the idea of finding the divine within the finite, within your finite structure. Which means, an example would be Calvinist thinking in Protestantism, where the Protestant work ethic, work hard, diligently. God blesses those that work hard, that are ethical, and have a work ethic. Once upon a time, work was seen as either an inferior activity, or seen as a slavery activity, or seen as a curse. No, be part of this world, and be a good person. Essentially, it's a form of compartmentalization, a form of, you can say, weaken the infinite intensity and fit it into finite structures. Then there's actual real compartmentalization approaches, designate a little part of your life for something that's more transcendent. The rest of the time deal with survival and deal with your Western structures. So these are seemingly two antithetical approaches, East and West. Does the finite dominate? Is that the reality we aspire to? Or does the infinite or the finite dominate? Which one is it? And there's a conflict. That's why in Buddhism and in Far Eastern thought in general, there's a lot about the monastic life, asceticism, simplicity. Because prosperity and many possessions, even as King Solomon says, mar b'nechasim, mar b'daige. More possessions, more concern, more anxiety. The simple life, almost ascetic life. The life that separates you from the material, from the finite, or the strict finite. What is Judaism's answer to this? So first of all, within Judaism itself, we find these two schools of thought too. I said before, halacha, law, seemingly is all about structure. This is what you do, this is the measurement, this is when you do it. You can't, if you missed a certain mitzvah that's connected to time, to a day, you can't do it tomorrow, do two mitzvahs. It doesn't get more restrictive than that, more confined. It's a structure. A structure that's aligned with the structure of existence. During day, there's certain mitzvahs, at night there are others. And at night you can't do things that are a day. Passover comes, it has its mitzvahs, Shavuos and Sukkot. You can't do the mitzvahs of the prohibition of eating bread. There's only 7-8 days of Passover, not the day before, not the day after. On Yom Kippur we don't eat, but a day before Yom Kippur it's a mitzvah to eat. And you can't change that structure. The day comes when the day ends, in its parameters. But then you have the mystical, the transcendent, the soul. And you find the conflict. You find people who are more soulful are generally less ritualistic. There's ritual, there's spiritual. SPI added to the ritual adds a different type of dimension. Can ever the twain meet, is the question. Well, you find conflicts actually. There's a classic disagreement between Rambam and the Ramban. Maimonides and Nachmanides. Maimonides came a little earlier. Nachmanides was a generation, 2 generations after that. And the argument is discussion, what is the ultimate reward in the world to come? Maimonides holds, now let's just make it clear, we live in this material world, we do mitzvahs and good deeds in a material world. So what's the ultimate reward? Is the ultimate reward in this material world. Tchiyat hametim will be the resurrection of the dead, and the final reward, the ultimate, will be where body and soul fuse forever and ever. Or is the ultimate reward spiritual reward? And though, of course, it does say Tchiyat HaMesim, we say it in the prayers, resurrection, so Maimonides holds that's only a stage. Because ultimately, the body cannot comprehend the depth and the spirituality of soul and spirit. And he gives an example, like a blind man can never appreciate colors. So ultimate reward, there's a stage where you have to reward the body for its participation. But ultimate reward is without the confines of the body and its needs and so on. It's a world of spirit. That's Maimonides. Nachmanides says no. That the ultimate reward, the final reward, is body and soul, which is counterintuitive. How does he answer the question of Maimonides? Spirit, we all know, is far more ethereal, far more transcendent than material. The infinite can be experienced by the soul. The body has its parameters, has its limits, has its ceiling. Hasidic thought, Kabbalah, and Hasidic thought, the Arizal, and those that followed him, his descendants, what's the word I want to say? His ancestors, and there's those that followed him, they embraced Nachmanides' opinion. And that is the psak, that is the final legal ruling. But what's the logic? The logic is because God, as one of the Kabbalists writes, Ibn Gabbai in Avodat HaKodesh, his book called Holy Service, he writes that to limit God and say God is closer to the infinite than he is to the finite is a limit. You cannot say that. So just as God has the power of the infinite, he has the power of the finite, those are the containers. In other words, there's a third step, another option that was not mentioned. It's not either or, either the infinite or the finite, either matter or spirit, or compartmentalization or some type of compromise, and one has to surrender to the next, or some type of dilution. There's another level. How do we understand God? You see, that's all predicated that God is closer to the infinite than he is to the finite, which is what we'd all say. Finite beings would say that. Because we don't understand something that's totally beyond paradox. But the truth is, the divine, that is, the real true essence of the divine, the core essence of the divine, is as close to finite as he is to infinite. Or better put, he's as distant from infinite than he is to finite. He's a reality that's completely beyond one that we can in any way define by saying he's this and not that. To say that he's infinite, not finite, is also a limitation. That itself makes it finite. He's this and not that. So what is he? I even say he. I smile. He is not a right way to say it. It's just part of the programming, conditioning. It's an entity that's beyond these terms, but you can come to it because that entity put all this into place. So essentially, you climb from the finite to the infinite, and then you climb to the beyond the infinite that fuses and integrates infinite and finite. And that's why halacha, the rigid Western way of structure, becomes one with the Eastern, which is that unity, full unity, is the infinite and the finite are fused. How? You can only come to that when you go through those stages. You come to a point beyond paradox. For us, it's a paradox. It's disturbing even. How can you fit an infinite number in a finite box? But this is ultimately the Jewish approach, which is why there's more focus in Judaism. It says you can reach deeper heights of spirituality through an action than through a meditation. Again, counterintuitive. Meditation is far more conducive. You cut yourself off from the world, no actions. You close your eyes, and you go to another place. That's conducive to infinity. You want to experience the transcendent. Judaism says no, it's the mitzvah. Because divine is not closer to infinite than the finite. And on the contrary, when you see a finite existence, I'm taking this one step further, you know that God is even beyond infinite because look, he created the finite. Which means he's not limited to being infinite. If he was infinite, how could he create finite? Everything he'd create should be infinite. So the Buddhists would answer, the finite is an illusion. It's not real. Since it's not real, what you're seeing is not really, you're looking at structure. That's a limited perspective. And Judaism would say, no, they're both true. The finite has a perspective that's divine because God created it. And the infinite has a perspective of the divine because that's also a manifestation of the divine. And the divine is higher than both. So we begin with two perspectives. A perspective from below that looks at Western structure that is defined, consistent, deterministic. And then there's a state of indeterministic, infinite, transcendent. And you fuse the two through action. Action does it. And an action can achieve more than a meditation. So it's a whole different take on God. But where the parallels are, that when you read Jewish mysticism, you learn a lot about the infinite. And that's where there's similarities. The step beyond, which is that there's also halacha, that there's also law. And mind you, halacha also comes from the word halicha. Not just law as in rigid laws, it means also movement. But movement within a structure, that's the ultimate goal. And if you look at our lives, we have three apparent examples. Really two that break into three. One, let's start with music. Is music west or east? Is it transcendence or is it structure? Is it finite or infinite? The answer is, it's both. Musical notes. To play music, you need to have sounds. Sounds are very tangible. They're very defined. They don't overlap. They don't confuse each other. They're played in their particular way, with a particular beat, a particular tempo, particular speed. And yet, the music that they produce is definitely infinite, transcendent. Structure brings you to beyond structure. And you couldn't do it without the structure. The human body, is it finite or infinite? I don't mean in how large. Meaning, is it driven by distinction? Are we a sum of parts of 75 trillion cells? That many organs and limbs and nerves and veins and so on? Or are we one unified entity? The answer is both. The structure is definitely made up of parts, but there's a coordinator in a healthy body that's beyond the parts. How do these two come together? How do you bring such ultra distinction that if one part of the body would join with another, if there was an organ convention and one organ says, listen, everyone, let's, in the name of unity, all of us are going to be livers for a week. Then we'll all be the brain for a week. Then we'll all be a heart for a week. Then we'll be lungs. You'd have disaster. You have to be what you are. You're a windpipe. You're a food pipe. Your lungs. You're this nervous system. The cardio system, the heart. Everything working in its way. And yet there's something that some choreographer, some force that says, I want you all to work as one. That's a force that's beyond distinction and beyond unity. Because one and distinct are like finite and infinite. Oneness, finite, distinction. And here there's a force that says, no, we can bring it all together. So what you have here, what you have is a fusion between the two entities. Now, I'm not suggesting that in Buddhism you're not going to find some similarities even of this concept, but the emphasis on the focus of literally obsessive details in halacha you definitely don't find. You find much more on the focus of getting out of structure. And that was so appealing to people who were trapped by the structure. But imagine you can discover both, the benefits of both. So ultimately, what Abraham really taught was the fusion of both. And they don't have to be mutually exclusive. Each has their particular strengths, and each has their own powers, and they work together. Now let's go back to suffering. So is this a world of suffering or not? Well, there's a famous disagreement between Shammai and Hillel, where Shammai says, more pleasant not to be born than to be born, because of the suffering of the world. Hillel says, more pleasant to be born than not to be born. The halacha, the ruling is like Shammai in this case, an exception. It's more pleasant not to be born than to be born, because suffering is dominates. Suffering overweighs the pleasantness of this life, even though there are many pleasant experiences. Quantitatively. But qualitatively, why are we born? Even according to Shammai, Al Karcha Chatachai, we're compelled to be born because pleasantness, the Alter Rebbe says, is not as pleasant this world as the world to come. But purposefulness is far deeper here, because this is the purpose. The purpose is to go away from the infinite into the finite. And the finite has potential suffering. Yes, when you're in a limited world, there's first of all just existential loneliness. The fact that I don't feel connected with everybody. That comes from the finite structure of existence. Number two, that creates separation, which in turn creates distrust, which in turn creates turf wars. Mine is mine, yours is yours, which creates the greed, the competition, the wars of this world, the injustices. Everything we see, how people step on people. Dog eats dog, the injustices, the selfishness, the greed, etc., etc. All part of materialism. So there's a lot of suffering is involved. The Buddhist solution is, don't desire as much. Don't desire at all. The Jewish answer is no. This reality of this existence finite can produce suffering, but it's per se not a suffering world. It's a divine world. The Rambam, Maimonides, hypothetically you can say, was not just the suffering. The finite nature of existence meant that you have to somewhat give it up to experience the infinite. But since God is beyond infinite and finite, He created a world not that should be suffering. He created a world for us to be wise, to realize that the finite comes from the infinite. And that the divine that is beyond infinite and finite allowed the infinite to manifest in a finite form, and our job is to reunite the two, not to annihilate one. So yes, to annihilate suffering, to get rid of the suffering element, but to realize we're not just trying to escape the finite structure, we're trying to turn the finite structure into being a container for the infinite. And that power comes from something that's beyond both. That is the ultimate objective. So we suffer, but we're not sufferers. We live in a confined world, but we're not confined entities. Because that confined element is coming from an unconfined place. Think of an artist that's beyond even being an artist, has infinite possibilities, infinite types of art to create, and then he chooses to create one. We see only one from our perspective, from below. But this artist knows this is one of many, one of infinite possibilities. So then the one is also part of that infinite possibilities. Our job is to be wise enough to recognize it. And for that we need the disciplines. For that we need the mitzvahs. For that we need, each mitzvah corresponds with another part of this finite structure that it allows potentially for suffering, whether it's charity, whether it's other mitzvahs that bring us and discipline us to not allow ourselves to get trapped in the finite limitations that can conceptually and potentially separate and divide us, which and unfortunately has done that. But to realize that this distinction of this world is really meant to come together like the music or the body or nature, which again is made of so many different species, and each species in its own unique way working in one coordinated, synchronized whole. So it's not annihilating the individual, it's taking the unique individual and connecting it with the infinite, in turn connecting it with the essence, the core, that's beyond infinite and finite. So therefore, let's take, for example, another attitude. You'll see this in the Gandhi approach. Everyone knows the Gandhi approach, which is based on Eastern disciplines, Hinduism. We never fight violence with violence. You all know Gandhi. Even when being shot at, we don't shoot back. Which for many people in the Western world seems very naive and very dangerous, actually. Because we live in a world, a cruel world, and people will kill you if you don't defend yourself. So the Western world thinks of it in terms of, I don't want to go to war, but I have to go to war, I go to war. Gandhi's approach is the other extreme completely. This world, its suffering and its pain is made by human beings. So if you don't reciprocate hate with hate, we achieve a deeper reality. Even though some people may die right now, but we haven't compromised that principle. Very admirable. What does Judaism have to say about this? Judaism says the whole world was created to bring peace into the world. So Judaism definitely abhors war and abhors discord and abhors battles, because Judaism celebrates Hashem Echad, unity. Unity with God and existence, unity between human beings, love, unity. It's the whole basis of Judaism. Klal Gadol b'Torah, Avos Yisrael, love one another. Lo nitna Torah, the whole Torah was given only to bring peace into this world. And yet, we don't believe in not fighting violence. If someone comes to attack you, or self-defense, you bear arms. How do we reconcile the two? Because we don't see the world as a world of suffering. We see the world as being a beautiful place, yes, but there are people that actually, it's not an illusion, that are actually negative forces. And sometimes you have to work with the structure against the structure. If the structure is destructive, pick up part of the structure, pick up weapons from the structure. Don't just bring in infinite light and say, oh, the finite will disappear. What you want to do is eliminate the hatred and the discord of the finite, but not the finite itself. Yes, if you and I are distinct entities, you could say there's two ways to prevent war. One is that we see as being distinct entities. We start saying, you know what, we're all one. Another is no. Recognize that distinction can bring to discord and divisiveness, or it can be two forces, two musical notes in one composition, two colors in one painting, two beautiful components of one mosaic. So the Gandhi approach is more like infinite. Embrace the infinite, ignore the finite. It'll go away ultimately. There's the other extreme, finite with finite, go to war. And the Jewish approach is a mix of the two. You do what you got to do in the finite world to deal with that, but your goal is not to annihilate the finite with the infinite. Your goal is to transform it, to be a world that is a world of peace on the terms of the world, not because you've destroyed the world and its distinctions and gone into the light, but because you've discovered how the finite and the infinite can be one with a divine force that's higher than both of them. There are many differences, many other differences, and many other similarities between the two. What's fascinating is that there's a language, at least. You see, Judaism, because it has both West and East, halacha, Jewish law, and its structures, and the Talmud, the body of Torah, and the soul of Torah, allows us to really appreciate and understand the different elements and components of this whole experience. So, in the final analysis, as we discuss this chapter, Chayesara, and we learn a little earlier where God says to Abraham, actually a little later, let me just see, after he sends him the gifts, because right after this verse, rather, then comes that Elu Yemei Shnei Chai Avram. This is the years of Abraham. They lived 175 years, and then he passes away. That comes right afterwards, so in a sense it's his final act, that which he sends off away from Isaac, while he was still alive. That is Abraham, which also is an emphasis. That means he's still alive. That means even as he sends the gifts, the Abraham lives within them. As I said, the sparks are alive. He sends them to the east. Al Eretz Kedma, Al Eretz Kedem. That we learn that right before he passes away, he leaves that final legacy, a legacy that would completely affect the world forever and ever, all peoples of the world, not only the Western religions, but also the Eastern belief systems, the Eastern schools of thought, and preparing the world for a time when all the sparks will be elevated, and we'll be able to recognize the total fusion. Recognize how each system, each school of thought contributes its particular uniqueness. And they all come together in a glorious symphony of the finite and the infinite and beyond the infinite. The conscious, the unconscious, and the unconscious, all the way to the core essence, which is the exact theme that's being discussed now as we study Ayin Beis. The discourse is delivered 100 years ago by the Rebbe Rashab, whose birthday, his 152nd birthday, was on Monday. So you can definitely join me in those classes. I give them every day, and they're posted on YouTube. There's an Ayin Beis channel. It's more in depth with text, in depth mysticism, but the ultimate goal is bringing them all together. And there's a verse that he states a little earlier that I wanted to also make reference to, that's explained in this week's Ayin Beis 100 years ago, where it says, "V'Avram zoken bo bayomim," and Abraham came of age and came into his days, and God blessed him with everything, which is also in this week's chapter. And it's in the beginning, early in the chapter. So he asked the question, what does it mean that Abraham aged, and then he says he came into his days, and what does it mean God blessed him afterwards? This is 24:1 in this week's chapter. And he explains that these are the three stages that I just discussed. Avram Zaken Ba Bayamim means that Abraham Zaken means he was a sage, studied Torah. He did mitzvahs Ba Bayamim, the days. He revealed the divine energy within the finite. Then God blesses him to see the divine energy in the infinite. I'd rather say no, the divine essence in the root of the finite. And then finally, it also comes down that he gives him control over the battle between matter and spirit, between finite and infinite, to the point that he comes to discover the unconscious, the force that connects the finite and the infinite. So you see many different references to this idea, and an unbelievable lesson from those Jews that have explored, have traveled to the East. There are definitely things we can learn from it, both from their seeking, both from their hunger, and also even things that they've learned. And ultimately, it gives us all a deeper understanding, number one, of the human condition, the human search for transcendence. And I would love to be able to convey to everyone out there, whoever's listening to this, and if you're listening, if you know somebody, to listen to this class and realize that Judaism has the answers to your mystical journey, to your mystic transcendent aspirations, to your dreams. And there's not a need to necessarily travel to the East to find them. You can try find them where you are. Today we have the magic of the internet, we have the magic of technology to be able to communicate that. Now, I try to do a little justice to the subject. Obviously there's a lot more to be said. But anyone out there recognize the treasures of Judaism that Abraham gave us, planted all over the world, waiting to be released, is in your own backyard. And that when you explore, you realize that Judaism is not just body, it's body and soul. It's a combination of West and East. It's a combination of ritual and spiritual fused as one. You have a healthy body, a healthy soul and a healthy body, and that the ultimate goal is the total fusion and integration of the material and the spiritual. God bless everybody for this week. Here in New York, we definitely need it with different weather conditions. But wherever you are, our goal is to connect the two. And please see me as a resource, as a friend, Meaningful Life Center, as an asset to all of you in joining together these forces. And hopefully each can do our part. And please, if any way I can help anyone, please contact me. meaningfullife.com is our website. Email, we have an email list where we send out every week email thoughts that are on these type of ideas. We love to hear your feedback, your questions, your rebuttals, your challenges, and maybe create a dialogue about this entire topic of Buddhism and Judaism, of spiritual and ritual, of East and West, and see what people weigh in, quantum mechanics and Newtonian mechanics, and the different elements of both structure and beyond structure, and how they all come together. I thank you all very much. We will be back next Wednesday night, definitely online, hopefully weather permitted, I should say, also on location. It's been an honor and a pleasure to speak to you all. Thank you so much. God bless you all, and we should all have a very healthy week, wherever we are, experiencing transcendence and bringing it into the existence, into our structure of life, in the healthiest and most powerful possible way. Thank you. Good night.